Myo Renge Kyo Nam Myo Renge Kyo Nam Myo Renge Kyo. Well, okay, everyone. Little camera trouble. I'm not sure. I think it just doesn't like that it's not connected. All right. Here, with my humble outlook, I have considered the differences between the teachings expounded by the Buddha Shakyamuni during the first 40 and more years and those expounded in the Lotus Sutra during the last 8 years of his life. Although both differ in many ways, contemporary scholars have already expressed the opinion, and it is my conviction as well, that the chief difference lies in the fact that the Lotus Sutra teaches that persons of the two vehicles can attain Buddhahood, and that the Buddha Shakyamuni in reality attained enlightenment at an inconceivably distant time in the past. When we examine the text of the Lotus Sutra, we see that it predicts that Shariputra will become the thus come one flower glow, that Mahakasyapa will become the thus come one light bright, Subhuti will become the thus come one rare form, Katayana will become the thus come one Jampunada golden light, Madhauglagyana will become Kamalapatra sandalwood fragrance Buddha, Purna will become the thus come one law bright, Ananda will become mountain sea wisdom, unrestricted power king Buddha, Rahula will become the thus come one stepping on 7 treasures of flowers, the 500 and 700 voice hearers will become thus come one's universal brightness, and 2,000 who have more to learn or do not have more to learn will become thus come one's jewel sign. The nuns, Mahaprajapati and Yashodhara, will become the thus come ones gladly seen by all living beings and endowed with 1,000, 10,000 glowing marks, respectively. Now, if you study your sutras, you'll know all these references and who they are, basically previously considered to never be able to attain the Buddha mind. Thus, if we examine the Lotus Sutra, we will realize that these persons are worthy of great honor, but when we search through the scriptures expounded in the period previous to the Lotus Sutra, we find to our regret that the situation is far different. The Buddha, the world-honored one, is a man of truthful words. Therefore, he is designated the sage and the great man. In the non-Buddhist scriptures of India and China, there are also persons called worthy, sages, or even heavenly ascetics because they speak words of truth. But because the Buddha surpasses all these, he is known as the great man. When he expounded the Lotus Sutra, this great man said, quote, "The Buddhas, the world-honored ones, appear in the world for one great reason alone." He said, "I have not yet revealed the truth. The world-honored one has long expounded his doctrines and now must reveal the truth." Also, he said, honestly disregarding expedient means, "I will preach only the unsurpassed way." End quote. Many treasures Buddha added his testimony to the words of the Buddha, and the emanations of the Buddha put forth their tongues as a token of assent. Who then could possibly doubt that Shariputra will in the future become the thus come one flower glow, and that Mahakasyapa will become the thus come one light bright, or that the other predictions made by the Buddha will come true? Nevertheless, all the sutras preceding the Lotus Sutra also represent the true words of the Buddha. The great and vast Buddha Flower Garland Sutra states, quote, "There are only 2 places where the great medicine king tree, which is the wisdom of the thus come one, will not grow and bring benefit to the world. It will not grow in the vast void that is the deep pit into which persons of the two vehicles fall. Learning and realization, or incorrigible disbelief. Or in the profoundly distorted and craving-filled waters wherein drown beings unfit for Buddhahood who destroy their own roots of goodness. This passage may be explained as follows. In the snow mountains, there is a huge tree that has numberless roots. It is called the Great Medicine King Tree and is the monarch of all the trees that grow in the land of Jambudvipa. It measures 168,000 yohanas in height. All the other trees and plants of Jambudvipa depend upon the roots, branches, flowers, and fruits of this tree to attain their own flowering and fruition. Yeah. Again, this is a metaphor, right? Therefore, this tree is employed as a metaphor for the Buddha nature, and the various other trees and plants stand for all living beings. But this great tree will not grow in a fiery pit or a watery circle. The fiery pit is used as a metaphor for the mind of persons of the two vehicles, and the watery circle is used as a metaphor for the mind of ichantikas, or persons of incorrigible disbelief. The scripture is saying that these two categories of beings will never attain Buddhahood. The great collection of sutras states, quote, "There are two types of persons who are destined to die and not be reborn, and who in the end will never be able to understand or repay their obligations. One is the voice hearer, and the other is the cause awakened one." Suppose, now if you're not familiar, this is identifying what you may know from early teachings as an arhat, or hinayana, or theravada. Suppose that a person falls into a deep pit. That person will be unable to benefit himself to the benefit of others, or to the benefit of others. The voice hearer and the cause awakened ones are like this. They fall into the pit of emancipation and can benefit neither themselves or others. The more than 3,000 volumes of Confucian and Taoist literature of China on the whole stress two principles, namely filial piety and loyalty to the sovereign. But loyalty is nothing more than an extension of filial piety. Filial piety may be described as lofty. Though heaven is lofty, it is no loftier than the ideal of filial piety. Filial piety may be called deep. Though earth is deep, it is no deeper than filial piety. Sages and worthies are the product of filial piety. It goes without saying, therefore, that persons who study the teachings of Buddhism must also observe the ideal of filial piety and understand and repay their obligations. The disciples of the Buddha must without fail understand the four debts of gratitude and how to repay them. In addition, Shariputra, Mahakashyapa, and the other disciples who were persons of the two vehicles carefully observed the 250 precepts and the 3,000 rules of conduct, mastered the three types of meditation known as flavor meditation, pure meditation, and free of outflows meditation, and the Agama Sutras, and freed themselves from the illusions of thought and desire in the threefold world. They must therefore have been models in the understanding and repaying of obligations. And yet the world-honored one declared that they were men who did not understand obligation. He said that this because when a man leaves his parents and home and becomes a monk, he should always have as his goal the salvation of his father and mother. But these men of the two vehicles, although they thought they had attained emancipation, did nothing to benefit others. And even if they had done a certain amount to benefit others, they had led their parents to the path whereby they could never attain in Buddhahood. Thus, contrary to what one might expect, they became known as men who did not understand their obligations. In the Vimalakirti Sutra, we read, quote, Vimalakirti once more questioned Manjushri, saying, "What are the seeds of Buddhahood?" Manjushri replied, "All the delusions and defilement are the seeds of Buddhahood." Even though a person commits the 5 cardinal sins and is condemned to the hell of incessant suffering, he is still capable of conceiving the great desire for the Buddha way. The same sutra also says, quote, "Good man, let me give you a metaphor. The plains and highlands will never bring forth the stems and blossoms of the blue lotus or the water lily, but the muddy fields that are low-lying and damp, that is where you will find these flowers growing." It also says, quote, "One who has already become an arhat and achieved the level of truth that goes with arhatship can never conceive the desire for the way and gain Buddhahood. He is like a man who has destroyed the 5 sense organs and therefore can never again enjoy the 5 delights that go with them." The point of this sutra is that the 3 poisons of greed, anger, and foolishness can become the seeds of Buddhahood, and the 5 cardinal sins, such as killing of one's father and likewise, become the seeds of Buddhahood. Even if the high plains should bring forth blue lotus flowers, the persons of the 2 vehicles would never attain Buddhahood. The text is saying that when the goodness of the persons of the 2 vehicles is compared with the evils of ordinary people, it will be found that though the evils of ordinary people can lead to Buddhahood, the goodness of the persons of the 2 vehicles never can. The various Hinayana sutras censure evil and praise good. But this sutra, the Vimalakirti, condemns the goodness of persons of the 2 vehicles and praises the evils of ordinary people. It would almost appear that it is not a Buddhist scripture at all, but rather the teachings of some non-Buddhist school. But the point is that it wants to make absolutely clear that the persons of the 2 vehicles can never become Buddhas. The correct and equal Dharani Sutras says, or states, Manjushri said to Shariputra, "Can a withered tree put forth new blossoms? Can a mountain stream turn and flow back to its source? Can a shattered rock rejoin itself together again? Can a scorched seed send out sprouts?" Shariputra replied, "No," Manjushri said. "If these things are impossible, then why do you come with joy in your heart and ask me if Buddhahood has been predicted for you in the future?" That passage means that just as a withered tree puts forth no blossoms, a mountain stream never flows backwards, a shattered rock cannot be joined, and a scorched seed cannot sprout, so the persons of the 2 vehicles can never attain Buddhahood. In their case, the seeds of Buddhahood have been scorched. The larger Wisdom Sutra reads, "All you sons of gods, if you have not yet conceived a desire for perfect enlightenment, now is the time to do so. If you should once enter the realm of enlightenment of voice hearers, you should no longer be capable of conceiving such a desire for perfect enlightenment. Why is this? Because you would be outside the world of birth and death, which itself would constitute an obstacle." So I want to remind you here, once again, the teachings of Buddhism from the very start, and again, as Nichiren is about to say, are about our Buddha mind in this life. We don't go to some other place. There is no afterlife. Birth and death is a moment-to-moment experience of this life. And so here it is. If you leave your experience of this life, moment to moment, then you leave your potential for attaining the Buddha mind. This passage indicates that the Buddha is not pleased with the persons of the 2 vehicles because they do not conceive the desire for perfect enlightenment, but that he is pleased with the heavenly beings because they do conceive of such desire. Buddhism is a teaching, pragmatic, of how to live this life fully, not to look forward to some afterlife. The Shurangama Sutra states, quote, "If a person who has committed the 5 cardinal sins should hear of this Shurangama meditation and should conceive the desire for supreme enlightenment, then he would still be capable of attaining Buddhahood. But world-honored one, an arhat who has put an end to outflows, is like a broken vessel and will never be capable of receiving and upholding this meditation." The Virmalakirti Sutra says, quote, those who give, and this is way before the Lotus Sutra, right? The Shurangama. The Virmalakirti Sutra says, quote, those who give alms to you are cultivating for themselves no field of good fortune. Those who give alms to you will fall into the three evil paths, end quote. This passage means that the human and heavenly beings who give alms to the sage monks such as Mahakashyapa and Shariputra will invariably fall into the three evil paths. Sage monks such as these, one would suppose, must be the eyes of the human and heavenly beings and the leaders of all living beings, second only to the Buddha himself. It must have been very much against common expectation that the Buddha spoke out time and again against such men before the great assemblies of human and heavenly beings, as we have seen him do. Yet, was he really trying to reprimand his own disciples to death? In addition, he employed countless different metaphors in expressing his condemnation of the persons of the two vehicles, calling them donkey's milk as compared to cow's milk, clay vessels as compared to vessels of gold, or the glimmer of a firefly as compared to the light of the sun. He did not speak of this in one word or two, or one day or two, in 1 month or two, in 1 year or two, or in one sutra or two, but over a period of more than 40 years in countless sutras, addressing himself to great assemblies of countless persons, condemning the persons of the two vehicles without a single extenuating word. Thus everyone learned that his condemnation was true. Heaven learned it, and earth learned it. Not only one or two, but hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands people. The heavenly beings, dragon gods, and assurers of the threefold world, all the human and heavenly beings, persons of the two vehicles, and great bodhisattvas gathered in assembly from the 5 regions of India, the 4 continents, the 6 heavens of the world of desire, the worlds of form and formlessness, and the worlds of the 10 directions, and learned and heard of it. Then all these beings returned to their own lands, explaining the teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha to the Saha world one by one to the inhabitants of their respective lands, so that there was not a single being in the countless worlds of the 10 directions who did not understand that Mahakashyapa, Shariputra, and those like them would never attain Buddhahood, and that it was wrong to give them alms and support. Now in the Lotus Sutra, preached during the last 8 years of his life, however, the Buddha suddenly regretted and retracted his earlier position, and instead taught that the persons of the two vehicles can in fact attain Buddhahood. Could the human and heavenly beings gathered in the great assembly to listen to him be expected to believe this? Would they not rather reject it, and in addition begin to entertain doubts about the sutras preached in this and earlier periods? They would wonder if all the teachings put forth in the entire 50 years of the Buddha's preachings were not in fact false and erroneous doctrine. To be sure, there is a sutra passage that says, quote, in these more than 40 years I have not yet revealed the truth, end quote. Nevertheless, one might wonder if the heavenly devil had not taken on the Buddha's form and preached this sutra of the last 8 years, the Lotus. In the sutra, however, the Buddha describes quite specifically how his disciples of the two vehicles will attain Buddhahood, and reveals the kalpas and the lands in which they will appear, the names they will bear, and the disciples they will teach. Thus it becomes apparent that Shakyamuni Buddha, the Lord of Teachings, is saying 2 different things. This clearly means that he is contradicting his own words. This is why the Brahmanists laugh at the Buddha and call him the great prevaricator. But just as the human and heavenly beings in the great assembly were feeling downcast in the face of this contradiction, that thus come one, many treasures, who dwells in the world of treasure purity in the east, appeared in the huge tower adorned with the 7 kinds of treasures and measuring 500 yohana high and 250 yohanas wide, the human and heavenly beings in the great assembly accused Shakyamuni Buddha of contradicting his own words. And although the Buddha answered in one way or another, he was in considerable embarrassment, being unable to dispel their doubts. When the treasure tower emerged out of the ground before him and ascended into the sky, it came forth like the full moon rising from behind the eastern mountain in the dark of night. The tower of 7 kinds of treasures ascended into the sky, clinging neither to the earth nor to the roof of the heavens, but hanging in midair. This is the story of the Lotus Sutra, right? And from within the tower, a pure and far-reaching voice issued, speaking the words of testimony, as the Lotus Sutra describes it. Quote, "At that time, a loud voice issued from the treasure tower, speaking words of praise. Excellent, excellent Shakyamuni, world-honored one, that you take the great wisdom of equality, a law to instruct the bodhisattvas, guarded and kept in mind by the Buddhas, the Lotus Sutra of the wonderful law, and preach it for the sake of the great assembly. It is as you say, as you say. Shakyamuni, world-honored one, all that you have expounded is the truth." Elsewhere, the Lotus Sutra says, quote, "At that time, the world-honored one, in the presence of Manjushri and the other immeasurable hundreds, thousands, 10,000 millions of bodhisattva mahasattva, who from the old had dwelled in the Saha world, as well as so on and so forth, human and non-human beings. Before all these, he displayed the great supernatural powers. He extended his long, broad tongue upward till it reached the Brahma heaven, and from all his pores he emitted immeasurable, countless beams of light and illuminated all the worlds in the 10 directions. The other Buddhas, seated on the lion seats underneath the numerous jeweled trees, did likewise extend their long, broad tongues, and emitting immeasurable beams of light. And it also says Shakyamuni Buddha caused the Buddha, who were emanations of his body, and had come from the 10 directions to return each one to his original land, saying, each of these Buddhas may proceed at his own pleasure. The Tower of Many Treasures Buddha may also return to its former position." So let's talk about all that for a minute. Of course, it's very colorful, what I often refer to as the hyperbole of Buddhist storytelling. But this whole lifetime of Shakyamuni, preparing this final teaching, again, he speaks constantly of expedient means, skillful, tactful teachings, trying to raise people's perceptions, expectations, understanding of their own natures. In the final 8 years of his teachings, as Nichiren discusses here, what he's in fact saying is that if one doesn't transcend one's own arrogance, one's own attachment to words, and even the thoughts attached to those words, one is scorching one's seeds of enlightenment. One is getting in one's own way. That ultimately, yes, even people who are stubbornly hanging on to their ideas of humanness and what human and the condition of samsara, our egotistical position, if you will, of attachments and hanging on to things and making things permanent, that even in his earlier teachings, he saw his students, even his most excellent students, so attached to the idea of enlightenment that they got that idea in words and in rituals and in so on and so forth, became their greatest obstacle. Remember the word liberate. It's constantly used in many different translations throughout Shakyamuni's teachings. In the scholarship of Buddhism, liberate is a word that comes constantly into the dialogue, into the writings. To liberate isn't to leave behind. To liberate isn't to, even the word nirvana, it translates as extinction. But it's not a life extinction. It's not an extinction from life itself. It's an extinction of the conditions of samsara. Samsara being a mental, perceptive experience. That experience completely tainted by attachments, avarice, greed, foolishness, not clearly understanding that life is a moment-to-moment process. That in each moment is the entire experience of living, of life, of beauty, of awe, of preciousness. That in each moment, each and every moment, we still have a mind of distinctions, separateness. See, that's an attachment. Even the attachment to the idea of me and you is an attachment. Because the truth is, our experience isn't separate. We force it in our condition, in our human being condition, to perceive it as other. But that's an obstacle. It's hard to grasp that. But it's something to meditate on. It's something to take your gohonzon and really, with great humility, allow the truth of that to blossom within you. There's the analogy again. Like a lotus flower, which sprouts its seed at the same time as it blossoms, seeking once again to instantiate in the next moment, one attains the clarity of the moment-to-moment process without being overwhelmed by what the previous moment brings with it and that the next moment may contain. Simply live in that life energy, that process of the moment-to-momentness. We'll be hitting these themes from a lot of different points of view as we continue, but this is the opening of the eyes. So Nichiren is really dissecting this. So please don't get lost in the words. Words are a very muddy way that we humans communicate. But unless we figure out how to plug a USB cable into each one of us and somehow network into one whole mind, Itai Doshin, right? It's what we've got, so we're going to discover that meaning together, right? Thanks again for participating. I appreciate you all. See you next time. Namo Myoho Renge Kyo.